Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Created in the Image of God, the Role of Religion in Society. I'm your host, Wade Fransson. I'm here with our regular guest, Jill Surik, and a new special guest for today, Brent Antonson. We'll be talking a little bit more about Brent's background and the main topic for tonight in a couple of minutes. Here in the United States, and I'm in Wisconsin, it is election day, and you'll see I've got my I voted sticker. It's kind of funny because, when I put it on the right side or the left side, it shows up on the other side in the image here on the screen, which is good because I'm not here to talk about how I voted. And certainly, God forbid, talk about how you should vote. We do cover many topics on this show, and religion does play a role in society. Getting heavily involved, certainly in partisan politics, is, as you've probably gathered from watching the show, not one of them. But in a past life, I was a minister, and it was literally against my religion to vote. In other words, if you asked me at that time, how did Jesus vote? How would Jesus vote? I would have told you, well, he wouldn't. He said, my kingdom is not of this world. And we practiced that literally, and we did not participate in politics at all. Today, I have a different perspective on that. I did go and vote today. I hope you did too. Getting involved in our civic duty and civic responsibility is, of course, very important. And again, we will be talking about many topics that may or may not have political implications to help you on your own independent investigation of truth. And we'll get into that a little bit more here with Brent as we move on. But I wanted to first also mention that given that this is created in the image of God, our discussions are largely based on the Word of God as we look to the Bible and other holy writings as the Word of God and seek our guidance from those. But we believe that science and religion are eminently compatible, and we will dive again into that a little bit more in a few minutes. But given that our focus is on the divine and the role of that in society, we're going to add a prayer at the beginning of the show. I don't know if we've been doing this in the past, and if so, if we have not, it was a miss. But we're going to try to do that with each show. So I've asked our regular guest, Jill Surik, who's a dear friend, a registered nurse involved in education and other matters, who's down in Florida after moving there from Wisconsin, to go ahead and open with a prayer this evening, rather, excuse me.
Yes, yes. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is error, truth. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life.
Thank you, Jill.
Yeah, no problem.
And now jumping right in, I'd like to get to our special guest today, Brent Antonson. Hopefully I said your last name right, who hails from Vancouver, Canada. Brief intro. Brent spent years living abroad. And for him, abroad means outside of Canada, right? Don't know if you ever lived in the lower 48, as we used to call it in Alaska, but exciting places like Russia, Iraq, and China, where he taught English in universities. He has circumnavigated the Northern Hemisphere by train over 5 journeys. And what really caught our interest here on this show was Brent's work as an author, especially in the field of physics and mathematics from a perspective of finding God. Brent, tell us a little bit more about your travels and experiences and what they have taught you and how it relates to what you've written, especially the 2 articles that we're going to dig into tonight. Did God leave a signature? Quantum Theory for Beginners, and A Case for a Mathematical God 2.0.
All right. Well, as for traveling, I was quite lucky. I got to, like you, get to Leningrad when I was 5 years old. My dad had won a trip anywhere that Air Canada flew, and he chose the furthest that they went, which was in conjunction with Aeroflot. It was to Leningrad, and so then we snaked through by train down through the Iron Curtain and came out through Hungary. Fast forward to the age of 21, a friend and I left Vancouver with $300 each and drove all of the lower 48 states, sleeping in the car in rest areas.
Wow.
It took 2.5 months to do. We were washing windows. Yeah, so I've been through Madison, I've been through Milwaukee, been through your area. I've been through a lot of areas. I've been through a lot of Florida too, and loved it. A few years after that, my brother and I went and did a lot of Europe, and I fell in love with Europe over going back to America and trying to go for a green card. My girlfriend and I decided to quit our jobs. We'll say this happened to get to Estonia. My girlfriend and I quit our jobs in Vancouver and moved to Wyoming to work under the table. And I got a job pumping gas at the first gas station I went to. And this guy with a big hunk of tobacco in his cheek, Jerry Coca, hired me. And I loved it. And we were there for a couple of months, but she couldn't find work. And so we returned home kind of brokenhearted. I wasn't making enough to sustain us in a hotel. So my brother was visiting two cousins in Estonia. And my dad said, well, why don't you take some points and go and see your brother for a couple of days? And I ended up going and staying with one cousin in Estonia for 4 or 5 months. And I really didn't like it. It was cold. It was always cold, and it was always gray. It was a transition.
What year were you in Estonia? Because I was there multiple trips as well, as you know. I'm just curious what year.
1994.
Yep, I was there as well, and I remember it being very gray. And they hadn't sort of recovered from the years they spent under Soviet domination and the antiquated way in which they produced energy and industry. It was very grim in those states back in those days.
Indeed. In fact, you would remember then that some signs were coming down. Some Russian signs in Russian were coming down and being replaced with Estonian. So there's a big move on to get that to happening, to make signs to make it look like an Estonia that you would want to live in, as opposed to an old Soviet Baltic Republic. But it's turned itself around. It's become a communications and internet hub of the world in these last 25 years.
Yeah.
But what a time. So, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, so how did that transition come from being a sort of a traveler to teaching English in some of these places?
Well, this is how it happened. My cousin was working at the Eesti Kristlik Kirik at the Estonian Christian Church. And I would help teach students ABCs, rudimentary English phrases and stuff. And when I got back, the next year after that, my dad, brother, and I took our first train trip, and we flew to Moscow and took the Trans-Siberian Railway to Beijing. 9 days on the train.
Wow.
Close quarters with family. And we didn't know that we would ever be able to do it again. But I fell in love with Russia, and I had this thing against Estonia. It was too cold, it was too gray, and it was too Soviet. It was too many things that I didn't like. And then I fell in love with Russia, and I've got all the 3 flags behind me. But I mean, I know you can see the Russia here behind me, but I've got all 3 flags. And so we took the Trans-Siberian Railway. And when I got back, I realized that I wanted to go to Russia and teach. So I got some certification and then got a bunch more certificates and filled my brain with as much as I could, and applied. I got a job at the Institute of Law and Economics in Voronezh, Russia, which is 12 hours southeast of Moscow by train. That's how they measure things in Russia. It's how far it is by train.
Yep.
Not how far it is to drive, but how far it
Right.
is by train. The train you can count on. Can't always count on the roads and the cars.
Interesting. I just saw a map. I'm a fan of maps of different perspectives, and one of them was the railroads, discontinued and obsolete railroads in the United States. There's a map of that. Just massive rail network that's not used, but of course in Europe and Russia, they never stopped using them.
They use them like interstates in America. They run
Right.
they run across and down, and you can get almost anywhere by train.
Yeah. And I know that you're aware. I spent some time on this show over the last couple of months talking actually about a sermon that I gave in Estonia in 1994, and that sermon was on Matthew 25, a pivotal set of verses around Jesus proclaiming what he would do at his return when the Son of Man comes in his glory. He would separate the sheep from the goats, and we spent some time on this show looking at that from a literal perspective and correlating it to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm not going to go into that here. I just want to say that for the audience, that Brent and I were connected through Daniel Sanderson, who was a regular guest here for a couple of months. And we had no idea that we had these quantum entanglements, right, where we had these commonalities. And so he was working with a church there in '94, and I was there giving the sermon. But we also didn't know on this. You went from Leningrad and ended up in Hungary. My journey into the Soviet Union started in Hungary. My first visit to an East Bloc nation was to Hungary and Lake Balaton, right? And then I believe that was even before I went to Poland and then Czechoslovakia. And at that time, I was studying Russian and doing work there. And I eventually ended up in Leningrad, which was my last point, right? So, it's interesting. You started there and went there, and I started on the other end of that and ended up in Leningrad. It's just, the coincidences keep coming in our discussions. And, we'll take some of that offline, but I just find it fascinating. And that's maybe the segue into your first article, Did God Leave a Signature? Quantum Theory for Beginners. So tell us about how this topic began to bubble up in your consciousness and how you began to, want to write about it, think about it, explore its relevance.
Well, my parents separated when I was 20 years old, and they lived in Edmonton. I was living in Vancouver, and I went back up to help my mom sell the house. And I had been raised with a den full of books, thousands of books, chess set, my dad's pipe, and when I thought that all these books were going to be put in boxes and they'd never come out again. And I was intimate with these books. I mean, they were on sports or on parachuting or on sharks, whatever they were on. I knew all of their spines from sitting around in the den so long. So I took 2 weeks, and every night I went downstairs and I read the inside flap, the back of the book, possibly the first page of every single book that was down there, expecting these books never to see the light of day again, or not in Canada, or not. I wouldn't see them. I took 2 books that I feared may be lost, and one was God and the New Physics by Paul Davies, and it is God and particle physics. It is. Paul Davies did an amazing job to explain to the layperson, and this is a copyright of 1983. So the most stunning thing that's out of date even now in the reprint is that we have discovered black holes. Prior to that were Cygnus X was. We were toying around with the mathematics and what it would actually be like if a star swallowed itself. So this book, I believe I read it twice, back to back, just going through it. And I've tried to impress that upon every member of my family and my girlfriends, trying to make them read this. I'm going, it's a meal. You can eat it. It's for the lay person. It doesn't use, a lot of mathematics or a lot of hard diagrams or anything. And so few people have taken up that challenge of actually reading it. And I realized that I wanted, when we were in Pennsylvania, we drove through the Dutch Pennsylvania, the Amish region, and I remember wondering who's coming back for the Amish. They're waiting for the second coming of Christ, and they're not going to use electricity. They're not going to use. They're not going to have TVs. What exactly are they waiting for? And who's in between there? And I realized that most of society, as many people as I've spoken to, don't really have an understanding of the basics of quantum theory. And this, to me, is something that really needs, it's a part of our reality. And it has to be, it should be at least an hour in science. Now, I can give you a little background as to why I'm not a mathematician and why I'm not a physicist. I started, there was a new pioneer program in Canada, in Western Canada, when I was in grade 6, French immersion. And you went to a school that was very far, like, 5 miles away, rather than up the street. And all of our classes were in French. So my math went from being 2 squared equals 4 to 2 carré égale 4. And I think that really screwed me up because I'm not into the mathematics of the physics. I respect it. I love it. I try and feel it. I try and I just really have a lot of respect for the mathematics that goes in behind all of these theories and string theory and stuff like that. So I know that it's on solid ground, even though it's not the language that I speak, even though I've written another paper on mathematics.
I have a couple of jokes about Canadians. One of them is, what is the national characteristic of a Canadian? And that is, now this is, of course, going to show that I come from the English-speaking part of Canada, and I'm referring to that. And my apologies for referring to all of Canada in this matter. The national characteristic of a Canadian is they don't speak French, right? because there's this aversion to it, right? That seems to creep in a lot of them. You may not have that since you were actually living in it.
I didn't speak French outside of French immersion. I didn't speak it in Canada for 12 years. Until I was in Russia. The Italian professor had French as a second language too, and that's how we communicated, and it brought it all back. Amazingly, yeah. But no, you don't use it out here. I worked for a hotel, and we had one convention for casinos in Quebec, and so we had a bunch of people who actually needed French to be spoken, so I got to use it there.
Yeah.
But
well, and languages were my thing for many years. That's why I ended up doing so much in Europe. I studied French. I had an immersion experience as a child in Sweden. I lived in Germany for 10 years. And while I was in Germany, I studied Russian to do these things behind the Iron Curtain. So languages, for me, I loved them, and they came very easy for me. And so, it always kind of was amusing to me that my sister and others who were born and raised in Canada didn't speak a word of French, and here I had grown up in America, and I was considered fairly fluent in French. Although when I was living in Germany and I was traveling to France, they all said I spoke French with a German accent, which I found funny.
my girlfriend and I just spent this July. We drove 4,700 kilometers through France and Switzerland and Luxembourg, but most of it in France, and 95% of it. I mean, if they speak English, they'll try.
Right.
They'll give it their best shot.
Yeah. Well, let's dive into a little bit now this first article, "Did God Leave a Signature?" I read this with great interest because it's a hobby of mine, and I don't remotely claim to have studied it or understand it the way you do. But it's been a fascination of mine. I think I may have mentioned some things in past shows here about it. So I'm really glad to have somebody who's devoted more effort and deep thought about this. But there are a couple of things that you wrote that caught my interest. Excuse me. The first one is I love the way you brought out this following point, and I'll quote you from your article. The very idea of God creating the universe is, as we have already seen, an act that takes place in time. When giving lectures on cosmology, you wrote, I am often asked what happened before the Big Bang. The answer that there was no before because the Big Bang represented the appearance of time itself is regarded with suspicion. Well, something must have caused it. But cause and effect are temporal concepts and cannot be applied to a state in which time does not exist. So the question is meaningless. I love that compact, succinct statement of that conundrum for the average person who hasn't thought about this and the lack of ability to intuitively get your head around it. But perhaps you could share a bit more about this concept and why you wove that in your article.
Well, that's one of the Paul Davies compressed. It's just a power punch of words, and why I chose to put that in there. Meaning,
so you're getting at something like the average person, right, wants to know, but something had to be before then, and the question is meaningless, right? So maybe you can unpack that.
And here you are asking it.
Yeah, exactly. But why is it that people don't realize that it's meaningless? And for me personally, I've gotten my head around this. I've been thinking this way, for 15 years or so, since I, started thinking of God as the creator of time, space, and therefore existing outside it, right? In other words, whatever God is, it exists outside of time and space, right? So that's one way that I've used to view God. So for me, it's actually kind of intuitive to realize the question's meaningless. But maybe unpack that. Why, help explain exactly why it's meaningless. Why is it a meaningless question?
There are a few things that we can't do. We can't achieve absolute zero. We can't stop. In order for that to happen, we would have to stop time. But we can use lasers and we can get down to minus 273.999999 Kelvin degrees. We can't exceed the speed limit, the cosmic speed limit, the speed of light. Now, maybe this is a good example. A lot of people will think through just natural law and through common sense that, of course, you can beat the speed limit. It's something that it's a problem. It's a technical problem. It's a problem of this or that. But
better engine, better fuel.
Yeah, exactly. But what it comes down to is that if you have a spaceship traveling 99% the speed of light, it is getting heavier. And the more fuel you put into it, you think the faster you go, it actually turns into mass and it makes you heavier. So you can never actually approach the speed of light. Well, you can approach it.
So you've answered the question, can God create a rock too heavy for him to lift? The answer is obviously yes, he created the speed of light.
Yeah. And this is where Einstein comes in and says that, well, energy is equal to mass at the speed of light squared. So for us I just went to CERN in Switzerland, the Center for Nuclear Research, which I was thrilled. It was a long time coming. Sorry, what was your last point?
The meaningless question, and I had made the joke about God can create a rock that's too big for him to lift the speed of light.
So there you go. At the speed of light, it equals mass. Now, nuclear bombs wouldn't work. Nuclear fuel wouldn't work if this wasn't true, but it does. Energy equals mass at the speed of light squared. And so it is not a problem. It's a problem of grasping it with your mental hooks, that there was no concept of time or space before space-time began. And therefore, there could not be a creator outside of it. Therefore, I'm just saying nothing caused it. It came into being, and both sprang in to being at the same time.
God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. How do you interpret that in that light? Pun intended.
Well, a few after the great expansion, it was just a bunch of plasma. I mean, we are really lucky to have come out of this goop. These funny little monkeys with with these thumbs, and which was to become far more valuable in the last 15 years with our phones.
How did they evolve before phones? Because they obviously weren't needed in the same way.
To grab at branches to get down.
Swing.
Yeah. So let's move on to the next statement, because this was one that caught me off guard, and I realized that I had misunderstood something. So that's why it jumped out at me. Quote, "This is the celebrated uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, one of the founders of the theory. It says you can't know where an atom or electron or whatever is located and know how it is moving at one and the same time. Not only can you not know it, but the very concept of an atom with a definite location and motion is meaningless. You can ask where an atom is and get a sensible answer, or you can ask how it is moving and get a sensible answer. But there is no answer to a question of the sort, where is it and how fast is it going? Position and motion, strictly momentum, form two mutually incompatible aspects of reality for the microscopic particle. But what right have we to say that an atom is a thing if it isn't located somewhere or else has no meaningful motion?" The thing that caught me off guard was I thought that that the collapse of the wave function, where you could identify the location and the direction, happened at a lower level of size, right? So, and I read the rest of the article, so I understand a little bit more. But what at what point does that begin to become meaningful? At what scale, moving from the quantum to the classical or macro physics level?
When
At what,
gravity takes over. When gravity, so the strong nuclear force holds atoms together, but they aren't really affected by gravity. And we have the standard model, which has all of the particles that we've discovered laid out, and their antiparticles. And then we have this empty box, and sitting alone and by itself is gravity, which we have no compatible quantum theory for. We only have a classical. We only have Einstein's theory of relativity, general relativity too.
so the strong nuclear force is what binds those microparticles together, and that's different and
Gluons.
distinct from gravity.
Yes, yes. Gravity is the least it has the strongest grip, but the least influence. I want to say influence, because it really doesn't come into play until you get massive bodies like the Earth size.
So I'll share with you this. Part of my fascination for this topic comes from this wasn't a mystical experience. It was a moment of aha when I began to realize that the practice in religion, I'm going to go way off topic here, but bring it back to this. And maybe it's of use or interest to somebody in the audience, or maybe it sparks something here. But this concept of circumambulation came up in a discussion. And circumambulation being the religious practice of walking around an object. So, for example, I experienced this when I was in India, and our car had broken down, and we ended up sleeping outside, getting eaten alive by mosquitoes, which I feared, were carrying malaria, overnight, waiting for this car part. And while I was there trying to sleep on this dirty, oily, hard cement on a dirty, oily piece of cardboard, in some town in India, off the grid, called Tiruvannamalai, suddenly the whole city was up in the middle of the night, and they were circumambulating around a mountain because it was like a new moon or something. And I was caught in the asteroid belt of parents and children and little three-wheeled taxi cabs and everything that were all moving, the entire city moving around this mountain, circumambulating that mountain. And the epiphany or the moment came probably 10 years after that experience, where this discussion of circumambulation, and I'm like, well, it's orbiting. It's the same as orbiting. And I realized there was a connection between this practice of religious circumambulation and the story in the book of Exodus about Jericho, or maybe it's Joshua, I forget. No, it's Jericho. It's in the book of Exodus, I believe, where the Israelites were told to, walk around the city of Jericho 7 times, or 7 days once, and on the seventh day 7 times, and then blow a trumpet and the walls would fall down. That's, to me, the only biblical example of this kind of circumambulation, which then obviously had some power, right? Created some power by doing it. And I began to correlate this religious practice to the physics of particles, and how everything in the universe orbits, right? At the micro level, we're talking about the strong nuclear force, but this same phenomenon happens throughout the universe at the macro level through the force of gravity. They, like the solar system, and its role in the galaxy, and even the galaxies, everything rotates around each other, from the micro to the macro scale. And then you have this religious concept where that plays in as well. And the Muslims, they do a pilgrimage and they walk around Mecca, and this is evident in a number of religions. So I just throw that out there. This is part of where my fascination for this topic comes from.
I did that in Mongolia too. We stopped the van and got out and walked around Aras a couple of times. A big sort of 10, 12 foot rocks, pile of rocks. And whenever you saw one, you had to get out and walk around it 3 times and then throw a rock at it. But yeah, everything.
It's an ancient practice. I don't know if you're familiar with Göbekli Tepe, one of the oldest archaeological expeditions, where those who study into this kind of thing have said that it turned history on its head, because they found that civilization arose from religion, not the other way around. But it had to do with circumambulation, and the fact that this site of some 11,000 years ago or so had this concept of circumambulation built into the way that the village, or it was actually a sacred site. The way it was built, it had similarities to Stonehenge. I'm way off point here, but it's interesting that, at the tiniest scale and the largest scale, you've got the same principle of particles connected to each other in relationships and held together by these forces, and doing a dance with each other.
Yeah, and an electron spinning around a nucleus is, that's what we based our science or solar system models on, that we're taught in school, at least. It's more an issue of predictability and probability, where you're going to find it. But yeah, you're right. The say it again.
Circumambulation.
Ambulation.
Say that 3 times fast.
While you're walking around a bunch of rocks. Yeah. Circumambulation.
Yeah.
Circumambulation.
Yeah. To walk around a holy site. So, now you quote you have this quote in here that, what right have we to say that an atom is a thing if it isn't located somewhere else, or else has no meaningful motion? And then you go on in the article to expound this principle a little bit, and how you can improve the quality of your instruments, but you're still never going to get them good enough to really fully definitively say, right?
Right. Well, if you're going back to the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, it's one of those things that you have to get your head around, that it's impossible to know both the location and position and velocity of an atom, of a particle. It's just one of those things that it doesn't matter how good our instruments get. It's a basic. It's there in nature.
So I'm going to go
on. Which is why I'm driven to explore God through quantum physics, and through mathematics, Because before the Big Bang and after the universe is gone, 1 + 1 will still equal 2. And you have two apples, you know that if you give one to somebody else, that now you're an apple short. That's intuitive. But it isn't, but equals MC squared isn't. The general relativity isn't, these are discoveries in mathematics take a lot of brain power, but the simple 1 + 1 still holds true. That's the concept that we have to start with.
But one of the incredible things about equals MC squared is, to your point, the challenge that it took to get there and the brilliance of Einstein's mind. But the beauty of that simple equation that is as simple as 1 + 1 = 2 in its expression, right? I mean, slightly more complex, but my son is now, in 6th grade and he's doing beginning algebra, and he could understand the equation type E = MC squared. He can understand the type of equation. It's that simple, right? The mathematics is just so simply expressed, and it works, right? How did it happen to be MC squared and not, some fantastically complex large number? Why is it so perfectly calibrated?
Exactly. Are you asking me that question, or is that?
It's
a rhetorical I don't know question. Why it's so perfectly.
It's a rhetorical question.
Good.
And the scientists would probably say, but of course it had to be, and it's simple, and they could maybe explain why. But that gets me to a different. I want to go on this tangent briefly. So, because of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, and the inability of human beings, no matter how sophisticated, to pinpoint both the location and the direction or momentum or whatever of a particle. In another practical way, when does big science become too complex for us to really ever solve, right? So, for example, climate change and global pandemic response, which are two of the contentious issues. And my position on these is that they are contentious because if it can be proven that it's real, that climate change is real, and I don't mean to cast doubt on it by saying if, but if it can be proven that it's real, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have the answer on how to stop it, right? Or that this versus that versus the other approach to solving the problem will not cause greater problems and more collateral damage. And yet, on that issue, or also the global pandemic response, certain measures that were taken to try to address the real or perceived fear that tens or hundreds of millions of people were going to die, was the cure worse than the disease, right? These are big questions when you scale it up to a global level, right? And we're dealing now with some of the fallout, educational scores, child development of some of the measures that were taken at a societal level. Is that a fundamental challenge of science, or is it a matter that we're just perhaps too much like the teenager with the car keys? We think we know more than we do about how to address and manage these problems. What's your take on that from a scientific perspective?
I think that we haven't. We've said so much that we haven't spoken enough about the we haven't agreed upon it, and even if we haven't, it's like the asteroid that's out there that's about to hit us. Even if it isn't out there yet, we best use the sciences that we have, the technologies that we have, to try and thwart it, regardless. So that asteroid will come, and we will have hopefully a solution. Climate change. Well, I believe that climate change. 25 years ago, I wanted to ride a motorcycle from Germany through Russia, Siberia, and across the Bering Strait to Alaska. That doesn't freeze anymore. So the climate catastrophe seems like a real serious problem to me.
I'm also old enough, and I lived in Alaska. I concur with you that the climate is changing. Some of the projections and some of the proposed solutions, might be more what is up for debate and question. But
Well, I don't know that doing what they're making the farmers in the Netherlands do.
For example.
Yeah, for example, we had air care here where we had to take our cars through every year for 15 years. We had to take our car through a special test, and it took a lot of my cars off the road. I'd have to go out and buy another piece of crap.
Yep.
But
well, I see
it.
that we have a question from one of our listeners that's more on point. We'll get to that in a second. I just want to throw it out there as a question, right? And here's why. We have spent time on this program talking about the role of religion in society, and that religion, understood properly, is non-coercive. It puts out the ideas that motivate individuals to transform themselves and their hearts. But by definition, it's not intended for them to coerce others to conform to their own transformation. And when religion does this, it gets into trouble. Is there an element of that with science or any area of scientific endeavor where the neophyte, let's call it the sophomore — I don't know if in Canada you have that freshman, sophomore, junior, senior metaphor, but sophomore literally means wise fool, right? The sophomore who's had 1 year of training and now thinks they know everything. The sophomores of science who begin to dictate their solutions and their answers and try to enforce them upon other people with the zeal of a religion. Is that a risk for science as it emerges as a discipline that is equal to the religion that throughout history has captured men's hearts and inspired them to build great civilizations?
I think that 90% of all scientists are alive now. That's a figure. That's a fact. I don't think that I think that scientists are shying away from the media. I think they're shying away from. I think that people who say that I trust the science over religion. People who are walking out of churches and saying, "Well, I trust the science," as though they know what the scientific method is, and they don't. They trust their phone. They trust
talking people on the.
And unfortunately, what some celebrity or political personality claims that the science is, or government leader.
This phone was witchcraft 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
Right? And
everybody of a certain age remembers the first iPhone.
Exactly. So therein proves evolution. Who wants to go back to their iPhone 4?
Yeah. Huh? Exactly.
Anybody? No.
The battery lasted for like 2 minutes, right?
Yeah, exactly. They turned it down.
Right. So here's a question for you, Brent.
Okay.
To get us back on track, I've gotten a question here from A.M. Sterling about the God particle. If you'd like to comment on that.
Okay.
Do you see that on your screen?
Oh, what was the search for the God particle and what is the status of that search? Where does it stand now? The search for the God particle, the Higgs boson, was predicted by Mr. Higgs 70 years ago now. And he lived to see it discovered at CERN. I don't get to do that very often, so it's hanging there, my CERN badge, my visitor badge. That was the last, that was the most significant thing that CERN has ever turned out. And that was largely why it was, why such a mammoth cathedral of science was built. If people don't know what CERN is a 27 kilometer long, 19-mile circular tunnel, 200 meters, 200 yards underground, and what it does is it takes packs of protons and it puts them going in opposite directions around and spins them around until they're going 99.99999% of the speed of light, and it collides them with lasers. And using more and more energy, we discover new particles. The Higgs boson was found after about 14 TeVs, I think, tele-electron volts. It took a huge amount of energy and research. Probably made the lights of Geneva flicker, finding that it was. And where does it stand now? That search, I still follow CERN. They still are trumpeting the Higgs boson as being the God particle as being the greatest event that has come out of CERN. And the reason it was called the God particle is because it is the foundation for all the other particles. It gives mass to all the other particles. So it was called the God particle. And yeah, Mr. Higgs 70 years ago predicted that it would be found at a certain energy level.
And is that perhaps analogous to the fact that, we've got this swirling particles, right, that are, indeterminate, and they're the quintessential, Schrodinger's cat kind of particles, right? But then once they get mass and they aggregate up, that's when you have classical physics and time-space functions the way we, equals mc squared because of that particle. If it weren't for that particle, that would never happen.
That's right. That's right. The Higgs boson was made sometime after the great inflationary period of the universe.
Awesome. So I want to then dive a little bit deeper into your second article, and thank you, A.M. Sterling, for that question. So going into your second article, The Case for Mathematical God 2.0, you write 1 + 1 = 2, and you referenced this a few minutes ago, 1 + 1 = 2 being true for atheists and believers. And you address the canard, the false perspective that the fact that there are multiple religions, might be evidence that, there's no God. It's just an invention of humankind. They all come up with these different ideas. I love the way you addressed this when you said 2 is just the same answer with different ways of getting there. To a Catholic, a Protestant might get there by 16 - 14 = 2. The Protestant might say, you didn't say this, but 14, anyway. So maybe Muslims see 1 + 5 - 4 = 2. Jehovah's Witnesses use -6 + 8 = 2, or the Mormons get there by the square root of 4, and who knows how Jews get there. Everybody getting to the same point with a different calculation. I love the way you put that. Can you maybe unpack that for us a little bit more, why you put that in there, and what some of the implications are?
Well, because again, I think that we're speaking a lot, but a lot of us are saying the same thing in society today. But we're saying it. We're either yelling it or shoving it down someone's throat, or putting it in a way that that is hostile to
we're insisting.
to discourse.
Insisting.
Insisting. And so there's all of these ways to get to the same place. And if we realize that the math was solid, that, let's say, climate change was real and there was no, okay, I'm not going to waste my time spending an hour with a flat earther trying to convince them. But that the earth isn't flat. But if we came to an agreement that climate change was actually something that, and this is beyond the level of the layperson, because they don't understand the physics that is going on beneath it, is being studied beneath, for the benefit of climate change, for the benefit of climate reaction. And this is why I think that it would have been good if I had had even 1 hour. The reason I wrote my first article was because I wish that I had given to me one class in high school. And you could see that if that had let off, that could have started me off on a trajectory a lot earlier, and made me pursue it as a career. I'm sorry, I forgot your question.
Well, the different ways of arriving at the number 2 as an answer, right? You referenced different religions using different math, but all arriving at the conclusion that, the number 2. And I just want to know what the implications were of using that analogy. Why did you tie in religions in that way, and the diversity of religions all coming up with a similar conclusion with different methods? What were you getting at there?
Because I believe with my heart, body, and soul, mind in God. The avenues to get there, I wouldn't have really called myself a Christian 2 or 3 years ago, but I was really exploring. I was reading the Bible for the third or fourth time when I stumbled upon the Baha'i faith, and I couldn't believe that in my entire life this had never come to my attention. And then I realized that they're all saying which religion is the right religion. Well, if you believe in God, if you have that as your apex, as your starting goal, then you come down through the different calculations of how people get to their arriving at God. So if Jesus Christ is your salvation, then that's your -6 plus 8 for the Jehovah's Witnesses, and et cetera, et cetera.
But it still gets you to God. It still gets
to God.
Right.
And I would have liked to use one. I mean, one being, but 1 + 1 = 2 made it sing.
But you're actually not a Baha'i, is that right? You mentioned the Baha'i
faith.
That's
correct. I'm still I'm in contact with the local chapter.
You're what Baha'is would call a seeker. And for the audience or anyone else, there was no Baha'i connection here when we connected. Again, Dan Sanderson connected us around this topic, and that was a shock to both of us that there was a Baha'i connection between us. Yeah, we might explore that in another show. I want to get to this next section of your article because this one puzzled me and I didn't really understand it. Because you mentioned you're not a mathematician. Yeah, well then I don't know what that makes me, right? Because I'm certainly not. I did with great effort when I was doing my MBA, my Master's in Business Administration, after resigning from the ministry many years ago. I spent the most effort of all my classes on statistics, and I managed to get an A in that class through sheer willpower and hard effort and memorization of some of the principles. So I kind of get it, but I'm absolutely not a mathematician. So I struggled with this one. So physicist Sanatan Hansda proved in religion, people believe that God is omnipresent. In physics, physicists are searching for the omnipresent truth. So we can write an equation for God as God equals truth, 0. And in this equation, the LHS can be correlated with religion and the RHS can be correlated with physics, where LHS and RHS are right-handed sides. You completely lost me on that. So I'm going to
quantum entanglement. Quantum entanglement. If you have two particles, if you have two particles that are synced together, and you split them and send them a few yards, a few miles, or billions of miles, they're still connected. So if you tweak one, you tweak the other instantly. This is what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. And so that's the math that came out. I posted that on Academia, and somebody replied with, well, it can be expressed in quantum terms then, and that's the formula that you have there. So it's not that I can deduce it much better other than you've got the left and the right.
Excuse me, your bath is causing me to sneeze there. I just had to. Sorry. So I can kind of grasp it more at the conceptual level. So quantum entanglement, where religion and physics are quantum entangled here.
Mm-hmm.
Got it.
And so that's what he posted. He said you could express it this way, and so I've copied and pasted that into there. And
so, as we reach the top of the hour here, maybe express a little bit more about that and how that helps you as you noodle around on life and your place in the universe and what conclusions you draw. And that'll lead into sort of the last question I have for you tonight, which is, where are you at? Not trying to pin you down on your location and your momentum, but where are you at in your spiritual journey?
Okay, so the question prior to that was, You've got
Unpack that a little bit more for us. This quantum entanglement. What does that mean? How do you use that as a lens, perhaps, to study or analyze or deduce anything? That quantum
I'm
entanglement
not
of
qualified. I'm not qual. That's a book that thick that I've read, and I can't put it into layman's terms, nor can I fully understand it. Which Richard Feynman said that if you do understand it, you don't. If you think you understand it,
yeah,
you don't. The quantum entanglement. I mean, Einstein fought against it for the last 20 years of his life. He didn't believe
right.
it was possible, and so I can't trump that. I can't try and do that. As for my journey, I'm more and more increasingly. I read before I even contacted the local Baha'is. I read. I must have read 3/4 of the scripture, and indeed, to me, it was scripture, but it was new scripture. It was scripture that dealt with science. It was scripture that dealt with politics. The scripture that dealt with 19th century things. It was far more. There was far more economy to reading Baha'i material than there was the Bible. There just seemed to be. It was far more beautiful. I know that translating from the original Persian would have, to hear it. When I was in Iraq, I'd go out and listen to the morning prayer at 4 a.m., 5 a.m. And I know that unless if you speak the language, it's got a beautiful, the tonality, everything comes through. But if you're not familiar with it, it's a hard press. The ears are easily worn with their music.
Yeah, some
And
some music I can enjoy on its own terms, but I'm a lyricist and I love getting into those lyrics. And yeah, there's a limit to how much music I can listen when I don't understand the language, and then I don't even appreciate the music at some point, right? It's the mix of the music and the words that appeals to me. At least that's me, just me, right? So I totally get what you're saying there. And in the Baha'i faith, there are it originates in Iran, and there are Persian elements to it, and the chanting of prayers, is deemed very beautiful for many, but there's a limit to how much that I can take when I don't understand the words. I'm more of a, my background there is the Apostle Paul, right, who said, look, if you're going to speak in tongues, don't, unless there's somebody there who can interpret what you're saying. And I love
well,
languages, right? But yeah, anyway.
well, I'm going to keep following up with my local Baha'is, and I find it far more in an inclusive age. It's a far more inclusive religion than any other. It essentially allows you to walk in
Come
from
as
any
you are.
religion,
Mm-hmm.
come as you are, and this is just nothing but beauty to it, really. And I was even in Suleimania, Iraq. I taught at the university there. But Suleimania was where Baha'u'llah was. Was it Baha'u'llah or was it the Bab?
Baha'u'llah.
Baha'u'llah was. So I didn't know that. I may have. It was very Muslim. All my students were Muslim, so I didn't get any Baha'i information there. But likely somebody would have told me that Baha'u'llah was in that jail, or was the jail, because I traveled all around that city. I had motorbikes, 2 motorbikes when I was in Iraq, so I rode
Right.
everywhere.
And allow me just to unpack that just slightly for some of our listeners who know nothing about the Baha'i faith, because this is not a Baha'i program, but so Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, was successively imprisoned and exiled, and so he was exiled in succession to different areas, and at one point he ended up in Iraq. On those successive exiles. So that's what Brent is referring to here, that period of time in his life.
Yeah.
And do you?
So when I
Brent,
read that,
do you speak? Do you speak? Is Persian? Is that what you said that they sing in, or what did you say? I missed that. I was just wondering
they
if
were
you
singing
understood
in
it.
Arabic.
Oh,
No,
okay.
I didn't. I
Okay.
wish that I did because of the beauty and the complexity in the Quran. I would love to have studied Arabic and been able to find out. I guess you could say the same things that there's songs in English that don't translate very well into Persian or that you wouldn't or into other languages. But certainly Arabic is one of those languages that they say that if you don't understand it, you're not gonna enjoy the singing and get the message.
My neighbor speaks Arabic, and it's fascinating to me. So when he's sang for me before, and it's fascinating. But I know what you mean. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Brent, we're at the top of the hour. Sometimes we keep going, but it's been a long day, and it's election night, and
Mm-hmm.
I do want to make sure that our listeners are not held beyond the time that they were planning to be here. So I hope you have enjoyed your time with us tonight. It's been fascinating and a wonderful pleasure,
Indeed.
and I hope that you'll agree to come back and visit us again, and we can dig deeper into some of these and unpack it. And anyone listening out there, I think the links have been shared in the chat around some of Brent's work, his articles, his website, and thank you so much for joining us here. And I do hope we can have you back in the very near future.
And really quick,
Thank
Brent,
you very much.
what did you say the book was? Just so you can repeat it for them and for me, that you read, the first book that you read that was really
God and the
pivotal for
New
you.
Physics. God and the New Physics by Paul Davies.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna read it.
You're welcome. Great.
And
Yeah,
are you
more than
working on
welcome.
any new books? You mentioned the one on Russia. Was it On Russia? It's called, or
Of Russia?
Of
That was
Russia?
about my year teaching in Russia. But the 5 train trips is now on a publisher's desk in New York. So I'm waiting. But it took 12 years to do the trips. So it took 23 years to write.
Wow.
Yeah. So, but we went to North Korea for a week. We went to Belarus. We
Wow.
we got out in the weeds.
How did you manage to get into North Korea? Was that difficult?
Yes. It was easier because we were Canadians, but it was still difficult, and we had to go through an English company, a British company that was stationed in Beijing, and they had a good reputation for bringing in, I guess, quality people. So there were only 300 and some odd people were allowed in that year, and so we were 3 of them. My dad, brother, and I went.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
Well, now we
but
absolutely
basically,
have
whatever. Yeah, we'll leave that for another time. All right.
Well, thank you so much, Jill. Any last questions or comments or thoughts?
No, I hope that you'll come on again, because I'm going to read that book, and then I'm going to feel a little bit more aware of what you're talking about.
Great. Well, thank you, Wade, Jill. It's been wonderful.
Brent Antonson, pleasure to have you, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, everyone. Click subscribe, like, share, and let's get the word out about this great show. See you all next week.
Okay, bye.